Our speaker is Hassan Mahamdallie. He was a journalist and socialist worker at the time of Stephen Lawrence's murder and is now a co-director of the Muslim Institute, and he's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and that should give us plenty of time for discussion at the end. Okay, Hassan.
Good afternoon, comrades. Yes, the Stephen Lawrence campaign was a defining struggle in terms of anti-racism in this country, but much wider than that, I would like to argue. And it did bring in literally millions of people into active participation in the struggle for justice for Stephen Lawrence and his family. And it provided a kind of impetus and a template and a way of going about campaigning which survives to this day. So in that sense, it was a watershed in that it was a real turning point. It was a turning point, I guess, for our side in terms of, one, it was a hard struggle. I mean, you know, let's not mess about. It's a very hard, long, protracted struggle in terms of Lawrence's and their fight for justice, and as people know, that struggle still continues. But it's also really a defining point for the British state and one of the key institutions of the British state, which is the British police. And to be honest, given the revelations which still are coming up, it still puts the Metropolitan Police on the defensive completely. It still casts a shadow over their operation, what it is they're supposed to be about, and what it is that they do, and for whose benefit. So really, for them, it was cataclysmic. So the lessons, I guess, learned on both sides of the class struggle. But let's start by what we kind of know and what we don't know. We do know that an 18-year-old young African Caribbean man, Stephen Lawrence, was waiting in Wellhall Road in Eltham, in southeast London, with his mate Dwayne Brooks, waiting for a bus on a quite lonely road, which Wellhall Road is, and they were ambushed by a group of violent young racists who chased them up the road. Dwayne managed to get away. Stephen didn't. Stephen was caught, and a knife was plunged into his chest, and he bled to death on the pavement there where he fell. The only words that we know were used at the time were, what nigger? So clearly, if you like, it was of racist intent. It was a racist murder. So we know, you know, some of those bare details. But to be honest, when I look back on it 20 years later, the more we know, the least we know, in the sense that we're still trying to unravel the truth about what happened, both to Stephen Lawrence and the police investigation and the involvement of the British state in that particular case. And we haven't really gotten to the bottom of it. It's extraordinary to say for something that happened 20 years ago. I guess in one sense, if I think back to an earlier period, the death of Blair Peach at the hands of the Special Patrol Group of the Metropolitan Police, we still haven't got any justice for that. We still don't know quite, well, we do know, but we don't know the full extent of what happened in the police cover-up in that particular case. So the more we know, the less we seem to know about the case. And what we kind of do know, and what falls into place for me, is the involvement of the police in the British state in trying to, one, shield the killers of Stephen Lawrence, and then, as the campaign began to grow, to try and actively undermine the campaign, to really paint a particular picture of the campaign. And at every point in time, in terms of Lawrence's advance in their case for justice, you begin to see the British state and the way that it tries to put a halt on that. It tries to limit the damage and goes to any extent to be able to do that. So it's a highly political case in all sorts of ways. And you know, let me put it in a wider context as well, Because since the Macpherson inquiry into the police's failure to catch the killers of Stephen Lawrence, it wasn't into the murder of Stephen Lawrence. The Macpherson inquiry was into the police, not the who killed Stephen Lawrence, because we know who did that. That's common knowledge. We know that 2 of them put away, but 3, maybe 4, are still free. But let me put it in a wider context. Since the Macpherson inquiry that reported in 1999, we've had the public revelations into the police cover-up of the Hillsborough disaster. We've had the Bloody Sunday inquiry into the murderous intent of the British state in Northern Ireland and their murderous attack on a peaceful protest. We've had the inquiry into corrupt links between the Metropolitan Police and News International, which is ongoing. And we've also had continuing campaigns and put it into the public arena around the police killings of black people, one of which, as people know, was immediate spark of the riots that took place 2 summers ago. We now know that the police were busy infiltrating some of the organisations which were trying to build the campaign for Stephen Lawrence and shut down the BNP headquarters, which was in a near locality. We know that they infiltrated other civil liberties campaigns, and we know they tried to spy on the family of Stephen Lawrence himself. So that's the kind of wider context about what we're beginning to uncover about the nature of the British state and the way in which it seeks to undermine these campaigns for justice, or seeks to cover up the behaviour of the police. And when I look back at Stephen Lawrence, I think I characterise it this: it was a black struggle in the sense that it was a family, it's an Afro-Caribbean family struggling for justice for their murdered son and to try and find out the truth, and for the perpetrators to be put behind bars. That's clearly the case. But also, when you look back at it, it was clearly a working class struggle as well. It was clearly a working class campaign for justice as well. It was clearly supported by large sections of the working class, as has already been said. The campaign was clearly given moral and financial support by working class organisations such as the trade unions and the TUC. And it was ordinary people up and down the country who campaigned for justice for Stephen Lawrence. To be honest, if you look at the chronology of it, the Daily Mail and all the hand-wringing politicians were very, very late on the scene. In actual fact, in the dark days between Stephen's murder and the launch of the public inquiry in 1998, during those dark days, the only people that the Lawrences could really turn to, apart from their close supporters, was really the organised working class and socialists and anti-racist organisations and so on and so forth. And that should not be forgotten. So yes, it certainly fits into our history of black struggle in this country, but I would also argue it fits in terms of working class struggle in this country, and that says something. And just to go a little bit further forward, next year we've got the 30th anniversary of the miners' strike of 1984-85. And I hope then revelations will come out about the role of the secret state in terms of undermining that strike, and also the role of the Metropolitan Police in terms of the way in which they were used by Thatcher's government in a very politicised role to help smash the miners. A year after that, we'll have the anniversary of the Wapping dispute, where the Metropolitan Police were used to smash the print unions in the East End of London and allow Rupert Murdoch to have his merry way. And we all know the implications, or begin to know the implications of that as well. So, this is the context really in which the Stephen Lawrence affair fits into. But there's also a particular context in London that was brought to bear in terms of Stephen Lawrence and his murder, and that is the organised presence of the fascist British National Party, who'd opened up what they called a bookshop, which was really an organising hub for the Nazis in southeast London. And the way the way in which the British National Party sought to link up with racist gangs operating out of various estates in southeast London, particularly the Thamesmead estate in southeast London, and how what turned out to be the two groups who thought themselves untouchable which were, one, the racist gangs who are operating, who are murdering people and seemed to be getting away with it, and therefore each time they murdered someone, they became more, they had more bravado and went more on the offensive. And the other group of untouchables, or who they thought were untouchables, which was the Metropolitan Police in South East London, and what they were up to at a particular time. And these two groups of seeming untouchables came together. And in one sense, you know, that dark night on the 22nd of April, when Stephen was, 93, when Stephen was murdered, you know, those two forces were brought to bear really on Stephen and in the immediate aftermath, of his murder. And what comes across most clearly, I think, in terms of maybe what people have learned around the Stephen Lawrence affair, is really what the role of the police is. Because it was quite clear, particularly as the inquiry began to roll on and so on and so forth, it became quite clear that we kind of lived in this topsy-turvy world where what the police were supposed to be doing, they were clearly not doing. What they were not supposed to be doing, they were clearly doing. And therefore, for you know, millions of people across this country, I think that became a bit of there became a clarity in consciousness about the role of the police and the role of the state in defending the police. I do remember going to a public meeting during the Lawrence inquiry in Tottenham in North London. And I remember an African Caribbean guy come up to me and saying, because I was reporting, he's saying, write this down. I said, what? The state is on trial. The state is on trial. And to be honest, during that period of the public inquiry, where you had these public sessions every day, day in, day out, for months and months and months, and the revelations became more outrageous as the days went on. You know, this guy was saying, the state, this is what it's about. The state is on trial here. You know, yes, it's about a racist murder, but it's not the first racist murder we've had. It's not the last racist murder we're going to have, unfortunately. But the notion of the state being on trial, that's what was in his mind. And in one sense, he said it in a celebratory tone. You know, not in a revelatory tone. He said it in the sense that at last people understand what this is all about, what has been happening, wider layers in society are understanding what happens to us day in, day out in terms of Tottenham, where the police act as an army of occupation in that area of North London. So, you know, he could see and he drew strength from the fact that, if you like, the veil was beginning to torn from the operations of capitalist society in relation to the police. So that, for me, actually, that was a defining moment in terms of what that guy said to me. Now, let's just reel back a little bit in a period before the murder of Stephen Lawrence to the 18 years of Tory rule. And it's safe to say, having experienced it, that there was a quickening of state racism during those years. If you remember, at the beginning of Thatcher's era, she said, you know, people have right to be, you know, scared of people of an alien culture. In other words, the dog whistle in terms of saying, don't worry, I'll promote racism in society. And that's clearly what she did. You had a real onslaught against asylum seekers during the period of Tory rule, which was then picked up by New Labour. But that's another story. But you had a real, you know, quickening of real barbaric treatment and scapegoating of asylum seekers who, if you look at that period of time globally, they were fleeing most awful wars. You know, we're talking about Yugoslavia, we're talking about, you know, wars in Europe. You know, we're talking about that kind of thing, but really being demonised by the Tory government. You had the beginnings of the detention centres, stroke concentration camps, and there is one particular one in Oxford called Campsfield House, which is one of the first ones to be set up. Which, I remember when I went there, I was shocked. I was shocked to see these people behind these barbed wire fences, being patrolled by whom? Group 4 security guards. Group 4 security. That was their first in terms of, one of their first ins in terms of getting a contract with the British state, was running the Campsfield Detention Centre for asylum seekers. And they grew horrifically this edifice of a barbed wire world in which they locked away whole families of asylum seekers and sought to deport them in ways of which we're only too aware in terms of recent histories. And you also have to say that during that time, it was unremitting, the amount of police deaths in police custody. Unremitting. I mean, it would happen time and time and time and time and time again. And, you know, it wasn't only the Metropolitan Police, but the Metropolitan Police, to be frank, were the worst, the most racist, the ones who didn't think twice about killing a black man and then passing it off, that he was a dangerous black man, we only had to defend ourselves, that's why the man is dead. And I remember reporting on the Brian Douglas case, and we now know that the Brian Douglas case, where Brian was killed by a police, hit on the head by a police baton on a regular stop and search, getting out of his car, that the police smeared Brian Douglas. They said he was a criminal. He had a criminal past. In other words, trying to build the mind in the public that this black man was a dangerous creature, really. So therefore, they had to defend themselves against him, and that's why he's dead. And they leaked this to the press during the inquest into Brian Douglas's death to try and sway the result and so on and so forth. So there's all sorts of dirty tricks going on in terms of deaths in police custody, the way that they would use certain sections of the press to really try and destroy the character of their victim. And, of course, we saw that replicated, didn't we, in terms of what happened to Stephen Lawrence. The way that the police tried to put out their rumour, helped by the fascists, fascists picked up on it, but the police put out the rumour that maybe Stephen Lawrence was a drug dealer. And all these things are still in circulation today in some parts of South East London. I live in South East London. I know that these things are still in circulation and so on and so forth. So, you know, for them, in one sense, for the Metropolitan Police, in one sense, the murder of Stephen Lawrence was not unusual. I mean, usually it was the police who were doing it. Now it was fascist-inspired gangs that were doing it. But in terms of the police, in terms of what they thought about the murder of another black man, not very much, to be honest, and what they thought when the heat came on and they could do about it, which was to smear him and undermine him, as we now know, mount a covert operation against the family. This is what the police did. This is what the police did. This is the way that they worked. It was not unusual. And to be honest, I think when you see the role, particularly of the Metropolitan Police during the Thatcher years, in terms of the way that Thatcher used them as an army, in terms of the miners' strike, in terms of Wapping and so on and so forth, to be honest, they did think of themselves as untouchable. They were Thatcher's boot boys. They were paid up members of Thatcher's strike-breaking band, and they did very, very well out of it. And because of that, they thought themselves as being untouchable. That's why I say that there were two groups in that particular vortex in South East London who thought themselves untouchable. And of course, the young racists who killed Stephen Lawrence, they thought themselves untouchable because the police, every time there was a murder in that particular area in the run-up to the murder of Stephen Lawrence, the police denied the racial motive. They didn't go after the people that did it, or very rarely. Only in one case did they convict, in the case of Roland Adams, they convicted a couple of the guys who led the gang that killed Roland Adams in Thamesmead a couple of years earlier, but they didn't break up the gang. There were these gangs operating. They called themselves the Nutty Turnouts, the Goldfish Gang, the Firm, and they were based in the Thamesmead area, although some of them had migrated to Eltham, which is, I know geographically this is quite complicated. You'll have to look it up later. But Thamesmead basically is a very isolated estate in South East London. It really is. It's built on marshland and on the Thames estuary. Very, very isolated. No buses coming in and out of it. And you could see the way in which a racist subculture could grow in that particular area, as I will go on to talk about the Isle of Dogs as well. But basically, they could have broken up these gangs, but they didn't. Because actually, the death of a young black man didn't mean anything to them, the police. So they allowed this kind of racist momentum to continue, which ended in the death of Stephen Lawrence. And the failure of the police to catch the murderers of Stephen Lawrence is kind of well known. I think we kind of all get the bare bones of the narrative about what happened. Clearly what happened is the young men who killed Stephen Lawrence, they ran off, they hid in local houses. Later that night, what probably happened is they got into a car. There was a car that drove past the murder scene, which the police failed to stop, of jeering young white men. Yeah, they probably went to Thamesmead, disposed of the knife, which is probably there somewhere under the ground in Thamesmead, and then they came back. Their fathers, who all of them were linked to major drug dealers, basically, and the drug dealers having corrupt links with the Metropolitan Police, basically their fathers got on the phone to their pet Metropolitan Police officer and said, "Oi, something's happened. We want you to do something about it. We want you to shield basically my son." Now, there's been a lot of speculation as to who that was. Was David Norris, one of the fathers? But to be honest, it could have been any of the suspects, because they all had links, basically corrupt links. Their families had corrupt links to the Metropolitan Police. The families themselves were racists, long-term racists. They inculcated that into their children, and their children had taken up knives and basically put those horrible ideology into action. Now, the kind of growing realisation that these boys weren't likely to be caught, that evidence was being disposed of, that alibis were being constructed, that police were being paid off to shield the killers. We kind of knew that at the time, and there was a great sense of urgency at the time that something had to be done about it. And of course, ever since the first racial murders in the run-up to Stephen Lawrence had happened, actually socialists, anti-racists, the ANL had been down there to Thamesmead, to other areas in that southeast London, trying to campaign against this kind of murderous climate which was beginning to develop in southeast London. Now what I want to move on to is Stephen was killed in April. In September, Derek Beacom was elected on the Isle of Dogs. Derek Beacom was a BNP hardliner, real old school thug. He was elected onto the Isle of Dogs. And the election campaign, I remember it very well, was accompanied by brazen, serious racist attacks on young Muslim kids around the East End of London. You know, I would hear stories, when I was in the socialist worker office, of a van that just driven down the streets around Brick Lane. A group of tooled up white guys had jumped out and they'd beaten someone to an inch of their life. And this was a regular occurrence. This was a regular occurrence. I mean, I remember, people will know, there's one of the victims was a 17-year-old kid called Qudus Ali, who was beaten literally with an inch of his life, and a photograph of his head the size of a football, because of the beating, the staves that they beat him with, was just horrendous. It was shocking. It was, to be honest, it was terrifying as well. Because what you have to remember is, on the one hand, you've got this kind of horrible relationship between the police and the racist killers of Stephen Lawrence, and the BNP operating in southeast London. Then you've got in the Docklands area, you've got the Derek Beacom. And this wave of racist attacks, in other words, the fascists trying to basically scare black and Asian kids, Muslims off the streets and so on and so forth, trying to dominate the streets through extreme violence. And you had the prospect at that time that a whole swathe of East and South London would go under the influence of the fascists. And to be honest, we look back at it now and we say, thank God it never happened. At the time, we didn't know it wasn't going to happen, that our side would be victorious. At the time, to be honest, it looked as though we would fail, that we wouldn't draw enough people to us, that we wouldn't catch them, that we wouldn't be able to take on the police, that we wouldn't be able to shut down the BNP headquarters, that we wouldn't find justice for Stephen Lawrence. That was what we were thinking every day. So we look back on it, we say, thank God it never happened. But to be honest, it could have gone the other way. It could so easily have gone the other way. And if you think, if they had got that swathe of East and Southeast London, they would have pushed into Lewisham in one end, Newham in the other end. In other words, they would begin to ring, if you like, inner city multicultural London. The fascists would have been able to do that in, if you like, cahoots with local racist gangs and with the Metropolitan Police, who were at least shielding the killers, if not encouraging them to carry out their attacks. So it was high stakes, to be honest, at the time, and it took a lot of hard work and a lot of individual bravery for people to actually push back the Nazis. I mean, trade unionists managed to argue the TUC into calling the demonstration through East London in March 1994. That was an extremely important thing, where actually trade unionists were marching through East London saying, actually, this is a working class area, we won't be divided, and so on and so forth. That gave an energy to the anti-fascist campaign to kick Derek Beacom out of the council on the Isle of Dogs. And that was followed actually by a very, very huge Rock Against Racism mobilisation in Brockwell Park in May 1994. So it was quite an intense battle in all sorts of ways. Now, when it comes to the BNP headquarters, the kind of source of the poison in southeast London, there are a whole number of marches against the BNP headquarters to try and close it down. at the BNP headquarters in Welling. And we now know, don't we, that actually the police had infiltrated one of the anti-fascist organisations, Youth Against Racism Europe, which is a militant party United Front organisation, and were feeding back stuff to the police, to the central headquarters of the police, to Scotland Yard. That's where that information would have gone. So there's no point top police denying the fact that they weren't involved in those kind of covert operations, because they were. We know now that they tried to frame Dwayne Brooks, who was the only reliable witness that they had to identify the killers of Stephen Lawrence. The police had him arrested, fitted up, really, on information that they gained through covert operation to basically discredit him as a witness. The boy had a nervous breakdown, actually, through that whole period. And therefore, when it came to one of the first trial of the killers of Stephen Lawrence, actually, he was found to be unfit to testify. His evidence was seen to be unreliable, basically because the police had done the business on him. The police had done the business on the only witness who could have jailed, at that point in time, the killers of Stephen Lawrence. And people will remember the unity demonstration in October 1993 on the BNP headquarters, which ended in what I can only say call a police riot. It was a police riot. I mean, we kind of know now a lot more than we did then. We kind of suspected that we were being fitted up, but we were being fitted up. Because I remember in the run-up to the unity demonstration in October 1993, there was a sustained press campaign that this was going to be a violent demonstration. We had no intent on it being violent. We wanted to protest the shutdown of BNP headquarters. But that propaganda, black propaganda if you like, went out in terms of through a friendly network of journalists, probably not unconnected to News International and so on and so forth, from Scotland Yard. So in other words, a public atmosphere by which the march of being criminalised had taken place before we'd even stepped foot on the pavement. When it came to the demonstration itself, I was surprised to see ranks and ranks and ranks of tooled up riot police like Robocop. I'd never seen before. I thought, what is this for? And we had to go through this gauntlet of these riot cops to actually get to the assembly point. And then there's a police helicopter overhead. And then in the first few minutes of the unity demonstration against the BNP headquarters in October 1993, the chief steward, our beloved Julie Waterson, was smashed on the head by a police truncheon and put out of action. In other words, the police had wanted to take out the organising centre, if you like, of the unity demonstration. And then they went mad. The police went mad. I remember my son, who was in a wheelchair, actually being threatened by a policeman with a truncheon. He was going to truncheon my son, who was about 9 at the time, in a wheelchair. And someone said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And only at that point did the policeman actually stop, because he was going to truncheon this kid in a wheelchair. But the police, I remember at the end of the demonstration, the police went riot. They were chasing people all up and down Welling, smashing people over the heads, arresting people en masse and so on and so forth. And then what they did was they pushed us up into a corridor past some pubs where the BNP were drinking, and allowed the BNP to beat up the stragglers. Right? So they wanted to teach our side a lesson, really. And we know now that that was coordinated. That wasn't an accident, that was coordinated from Scotland Yard in terms of trying to discredit not just the demonstrators, but of course the whole Stephen Lawrence campaign at the same time. And we should remember that the Mail on Sunday ran a headline on the next day, "Masked Mob Stones Police." In other words, trying to put across the idea that that the aggression came from our side. But I can tell you that was not the case. And in September 1995, 9 Welling protesters were sentenced to a total of 20 years and 6 months in prison. People spent a long, long time in prison, basically, for defending that demonstration. And I would like to remember them in one sense, as well as Julie Waterson, because actually those people, they paid a lot of prison time for what they did, which we now know was basically a fit up by the police. Yeah? That's an injustice in and of itself, is it not? Now, I'd like to jump forward, because I haven't got much time, to 1997 and the inquiry. And the inquiry was a sustained effort by the Lawrence family and its supporters to try and force the fact that no one had been convicted of Stephen's murder onto the political agenda. And Jack Straw, who was the incoming Home Secretary, had made a promise to the Lawrence family, which he was forced really to deliver on when Labour got into power in May 1997, that there would be a public inquiry. But Jack Straw, although he conceded there should be a public inquiry, actually tried to, if you like, limit the implications of it. I don't think he understood actually what he was he was sanctioning, because, to be honest, the whole inquiry ran out of the control of the British state almost from day one. But he assigned a man called Sir William Macpherson of Cluny, not off a council estate, to chair the inquiry with a set of advisors. Now, Macpherson Cluny, actually, the Lawrence family objected to him being the head of an inquiry because he had such a bad record in terms of prosecuting asylum seekers in immigration courts and so on and so forth, so getting them deported. But the extraordinary thing was, because Chris Harman, as editor social worker, allowed me to go down almost every day, usually by tube, apart from the day there was a tube strike and I had to go on the bike. But he let me go down every day. And to be honest, I could see Macpherson faced with all these cops who were clearly corrupt, saying, this wasn't a racist murder, nothing to do with me, Gov, who was Stephen Lawrence anyway, ... All the procession of people who were involved in the murder team, who was supposed to be solving the case of Stephen Lawrence, basically showing on the witness stand that they really didn't give two figs about this young black man and his fate, and were clearly dodgy characters. I mean, you wouldn't buy a watch off of these geezers in a pub. And these were the murder squad. This is the South East London murder squad. We now know, of course, they all had criminal connections. They're running bars in Marbella off money they basically skimmed. Come on, libel, take me to court. Basically skimmed off of drug dealers in South East London, and major criminals in South East London involved in big cases like Brinkmax bullion robbery. They all got their payoff from those kind of operations. When these people took the stand, you could see the pennies drop from Sir William Macpherson of Cluny's eyes. He couldn't believe, basically, the arrogance and incompetence and the denial of any racist motive in terms of the police. And it all began to unravel, really, for the British state. At the same time, you had there was about 100 chairs in the inquiry, which anyone in the general public could come to. And basically, it turned into a people's court. It was like Vox Populi. So every time some corrupt officer got on the stand and said, I don't think it was a racist murder, I think it was gangs, Gov, basically people go, what? What are you talking about? Or when, Mike Mansfield, one of the lawyers, the barrister for the Stephen Lawrence campaign, really, interrogated these coppers and basically tore them to shreds in front of your eyes. A great big roar went up from the public gallery. These people in the public gallery, plus the operation of these corrupt racist police on the stand, actually pushed the whole inquiry to much more radical conclusions than it was supposed to have happened. It began to get seriously out of control. When Sir Paul Condon, who was the commander, the chief of the Metropolitan Police, took the stand, he was so awful because he wouldn't admit the word racism. It wouldn't come out of his lips. In actual fact, he put out a press statement before he took the stand saying, no proof of racism or corruption in the Stephen Lawrence case. It was a disaster, PR disaster for the Metropolitan Police. It looked at that point in time that actually what the conclusion would arise was the Metropolitan Police should be disbanded. They should be disbanded. The Metropolitan Police are a corrupt, racist bunch of people from the top to the bottom, and they should be disbanded. I was quite interested to read Simon Jenkins in The Guardian about 2 weeks ago in terms of latest revelations about Metropolitan Police, saying the Metropolitan Police should be broken up. I wish Simon Jenkins had been saying it 20 years ago, do you know what I mean, on other people like that. But at the time, that was the slogan on ordinary people's lips. Scrap the Met. Get rid of the Met. These people are the problem. They're not a solution to anything in society. These people are the problem. These are the people that left Stephen's killers off the hook. These are the people who are institutionally racist and so on and so forth. And I have to say, also, in terms of it was a very, very political inquiry in terms of the public gallery and all those kind of things. Also, day in, day out, trade union delegations would turn up. There would also be trade union days where basically people would bring their banners and give money to the Lawrences and so on and so forth. But basically trade unions would turn up. I never saw anyone from the Daily Mail with a banner saying, we support the Lawrences. It was trade unionists. And I remember Neville Lawrence going to the TUC in 1998 and saying, in the dark days when no one would support us, someone said, go to the trade unions. They'll support you. And you did. And to be honest, if you talk to Neville, you'll know that is the position he holds today. That actually the people who really funded and backed the campaign were the trade unions. The organised working class. And that's why I say it's a working class campaign. So it all began to run. Run out of control, and of course, and I'll sum up with this: the whole idea that the Metropolitan Police and other organs of the state could be institutionally racist was incredibly important. There had been an inquiry into the Brixton riots of 1981, where Lord Scarman, who chaired the inquiry, had a conclusion that actually the police weren't being racist. That's not the reason why the riot happened in 1981, but there might be a few bad apples in the barrel. Really, the Lawrence inquiry said the barrel is rotten. The whole thing is rotten. That's really what institutional racism meant. And what it meant was this, was that actually, despite the myths which are propagated from above, actually the reservoir of racism in this society is not actually from the working class. It's not the working class who are racist, naturally racist, and if you like, their racism wells up into the rest of society. It's the other way around. And actually racism is encouraged and engineered and is a product of class relations and the interests of people at the top of society, and it pushes itself down into society. That dynamic, that we have been told, if you like, the Lawrence inquiry turned it on its head and showed actually who are the real forces in society who are propagating racism, who are defending racists, who are working tooth and nail, if you like, to propagate racism within our society. It is the pillars of the state, one of which is the police. The police are one of the pillars of the state. It is in their DNA. It's not an accident. It's not just one racist copper. Actually, it's the operation of the whole of the whole organism, which is the problem. That was really the power of the notion of the finding of the Macpherson inquiry that institutional racism was really the problem as to why Stephen Lawrence's murderers had got away with it. And so, very, very finally, the Lawrence inquiry, I think, was an immense shift in terms of working class people, in terms of their understanding of racism, how it operates, and so on and so forth. I think that's true. Their active involvement in the campaign around the Lawrences actually was life-changing, I think, for very, very many people. And to be honest, it's taken a lot for the state to begin to roll back the gains of Stephen Lawrence. It's been unremitting the way in which they've tried to take apart Stephen Lawrence, not only just in terms of ignoring the recommendations of the inquiry report, but in terms of the drip racism that they keep on pumping into society. It's taken a lot for them to try and reel back the gains of Stephen Lawrence. And I don't think that they have succeeded. They might have succeeded at an institutional level, at a governmental level, but I don't think they've succeeded at a popular level in terms of how ordinary working class people view the police and where they think racism comes from in terms of society. So that's an immense shift. And I think I have to say this. People say that the Lawrences are dignified. To be honest, it wasn't really that they were dignified. They were really bloody angry, They were really angry, but they knew that they had to hold it together to get as far as they did get, or as they have got, because they haven't got all the way. But to be honest, yes, it's true that individuals make history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing. You can say that's definitely the Lawrences in terms of the way that they've provided leadership over this particular question. But you also have to understand the kind of the network of support that sustained them. No one can do that on their own. No one can do that on their own. And actually, to be honest, there's people in this room, outside this room, in British society in general, who've made sure that that Stephen Lawrence has not been forgotten, that lessons are being drawn, that people understand more about the mechanics of racism in a capitalist society and the role of police in defending class relations and so on and so forth. That is very, very difficult for anyone, whether it's Tory or New Labour, to roll back. This, I end on this, is still unfinished business. Watch this space.
Yeah, Balwinder Rana from Southall. Yeah, even going back into the 70s, the police always treated the racist murders as, the black people being killed by the racists didn't really matter. In 1976, a young lad called Gurdeep Chaggar was knifed to death in Southall by a gang of racists. Some number of Asian youth went to the police station to protest, and the police arrested them. That caused a real explosion in the whole community, and immediately hundreds of, maybe thousands of other people came, mainly youth, and they picked the police station, occupied all the roads around. And, but that may have just finished there. But after that, following week, we organized a march in London, because what had happened was Enoch Powell had made his speech against the Malawi Asians coming to this country in '76. That had led to the murder of Gurdeep Chaggar. So we held a march in central London against Enoch Powell. So we brought a lot of people from there to London to widen the whole issue. After that, in Brick Lane, Altaf Ali was killed by racists, then Ishaq Ali, and every time there was a massive demonstration, which we sort of supported. Then there were 3 murders in a matter of weeks. After the 3rd murder, again the Bengalis want to hold a massive march from Brick Lane to Hyde Park. And now, I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet, but I said, at the time, I think rather than marching, what they should do is they should occupy the main roads in the area. And that's what they exactly did. They occupied the main roads, and there were thousands and thousands of people, and that made the state basically aware. Because the power the people had, they could sort of basically affect the sort of local traffic, at least, you know. And after that, the police started taking a bit more care. But then again, in 1979, in Southall, all that was going to happen was 30 or 40 fascists came there to hold a meeting. And we had got 10,000 signatures saying against them they should not be allowed to hold a meeting. But the police insisted that they are going to let them hold a meeting. As a result of that, the whole community came out again to protest against this National Front meeting. And the police, rather than sort of saying that, okay, if there's so much opposition in the community, they will not let the fascists come to Southall. Instead, nearly 4,000 police turned up, the special patrol group, and they brutalized the whole community. They arrested 700 people, out of whom 342 were charged. Some people went to prison. And that was all because basically they did not really care how we felt in Southall or how the Asian and black communities have felt against racist fascists. So all the time trying to sort of impose them upon us, they were trying to sort of deny us our own rights. And that is why I think, but all those struggles which we are fought, they fed into the, what already mentioned, the really big march in Welling, and again I was there, and basically each one has been a stepping stone, although they've been trying to sort of impose their own racist ideas upon us, but we have always been fighting back, and we should continue doing so. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Monica, and I live in South East London, and was living in South East London at the time when these murders were happening. And I think what I wanted to really talk about was the other side of how things felt in South East London at that time, because I think Hass is absolutely right. There'd been, he's described that really well, the 3 young black men that were murdered within a 5-mile radius of each other and that. But what I wanted to just talk a little bit about is how our side reacted to that and how it was. Because in the media at that time, they portrayed Eltham, Thamesmead, and pretty much the whole of Greenwich as a no-go area for black people, definitely a no-go area for anti-racists and anti-fascists. And actually, we didn't feel like that, and we made sure that other people didn't feel like that in that area. We went out every single night and leafleted houses. We leafleted tower blocks with 2 of us in a tower block. We felt we owned this area. This was our area. It wasn't their area, it was ours. So we didn't need security guards to take us up and down the tower blocks. When we leafleted, we knocked on people's doors and we asked them to sign a petition to shut down the BNP headquarters. We were confident, and I know Hass says we could have lost. I never knew that. I never knew that we thought we could have lost. I was 20-something at the time and really felt that we were going to win this because we had to win this. There was no other choice. If we didn't win this, our kids could not grow up in this area. My son would not be able to walk the streets as he can today if we didn't win. So this was absolutely vital for us. We had a protest outside the council chamber in Bexley of 1,500 people. We had a public meeting of 700 people. So we were everywhere. And what we did was every single night we put up posters. And when the BNP put up their posters, the wallpaper paste hadn't dried on it before we took them down and put ours up instead of them, because we lived there. We were on every street. We were in the majority, and yes, these people were vicious and nasty, but they were in the minority. And an example of how we were in the majority was the one night myself and another comrade were at Plumstead Station, and we were taking off their stickers, and a couple of BNP members came into the station. We clocked them, and got out there, and they chased us and followed us. We ran into one of the local shops. Now the shopkeepers protect us. They shut the doors and locked them to protect us into the shops because they knew us. We'd been around there. We lived there, and I think that was sort of the other side of South East London because the media really portrayed it as an area where no anti-fascists could go. We were on the streets every single week.
I think Haz has done a brilliant speech there about it, and I'll tell you why. Because I tell you, when Stephen Lawrence was murdered, I remember the wave of anger that took place across London and the rest of the country, and the police were the only group of people who didn't understand what was going on. I remember going on that march, actually, when we first stormed the headquarters. It's full of, it's been mentioned about the first demonstration that went there, and we smashed, a group were black and smashed up the windows of that. And you know, what was important is, I remember Claire Dishington actually ringing me up and saying, come down to the, sorry, I shouldn't maybe mention, but she did, rang me up and said, come down to the inquiry because it's really important. I thought, this guy Clooney is the ex-head of the SAS, right? There's nothing that's going to come out of this inquiry. There's nothing that's going to come out. But the truth is, they couldn't hide all of it. And to be honest, I remember Haz and I going to the Roland Adams campaign and saying, maybe the police will try and infiltrate and do different things to our campaign. And I remember everybody in the room looking at each other going, those two are mad. Right? We didn't say it loud enough, actually, I think, when you actually look at what they were up to. There were 6 I remember one murder of Ruhullah Ramesh, actually. But there was one murder after the other in terms of whatever it is. I remember one officer, was it Officer Coles, who went to a station and gave a brown bag, right, from a criminal, and they said, what was in the brown bag? He said, I went all the way off to the M25 to get lunch. I remember Clooney sitting there going, you could see his face changing in rage at these people, and one of them said, I don't have to talk about the boy. But what I want to say as well about the role of Socialist Worker, because Neville Lawrence told me he read Socialist Worker all the time, and why he came and spoke in Tottenham was because he said it was a paper right at the beginning that said this was a racist murder, that something should be done about it, and he never forgot it, because it wasn't the Daily Mail that he read because he was decorating somebody's house. I'm not saying that changed everything, but I'm saying there was a red line. There was a thin red line in that, and that expanded because it was linked to everything in society. So what I think is, when we talk about transforming, when people look at the state and the way that the police, people say that the police have changed. When you see the murder of Mark Duggan, right? I tell you what has changed. What's changed is that when they say I'm Dixon or Doc Green, people don't believe them. Lots of people don't believe them, but they don't believe them because of Orgreave, because of what's happened in Hillsborough, because our class is beaten up and controlled by those people. But they don't only use that; they use the idea that they're there to help us. They use both ideas at the same time. And I want to say that when we talk about transforming society, actually lifting up the lid on the rotten, filthy society that we live in is one of the most important things that can be done. And I think when at the time, I'm sure Haz, as a reporter, very young, went down there. One of the things, the clarity of what he argued motivated you to think you can take on the state. Because the idea, Paul Condon should have been sacked. And I tell you who saved Paul Condon. Jack Straw saved Paul Condon at that time, because we were ready to march, we were ready to take those people on. And I tell you what, the lesson I learned, the question is, if you're going to fight against the state, I'm going to shut up. You need an organisation, you need clarity of thought, and you need the determination to say we're going to live in a better society.
Yes, when Haz said that in some respects, it wasn't inevitable, we weren't sure whether or not we were going to win. And yes, that for so many of us, there were so many instances where it was really hairy. On the day that Beacon was elected, that evening on the Isle of Dogs, BNP members were roaming around the estates. There's someone that I know, many other comrades will also know him, Sandy Nichol, who had his head kicked in when we sent anti-racists in there to try and oppose the BNP. And they did that deliberately to try and put the fear of God into the Asian community so that they wouldn't go out to vote. After Beacon's election, Andrew is absolutely right. We did go onto the estates, but it wasn't always easy. I remember going onto the estates in Tower Hamlets, and we did the door-to-door leafleting. We had the petition and everything, and you were arguing with people. And a woman who was really reasonable, we had a conversation for 10 minutes, absolutely fantastic. Then she suddenly started saying that, there's a woman down the road from her who's in a wheelchair. She's not been able to get any assistant for absolutely ages because the council doesn't care. But the council's spending loads of money on all the banglers, as she put it. The banglers are getting all the housing, etc., etc. She turned around, and when I challenged her, she turned around and said, "You're not from here. Get back to where you came from. You've not been off the boat for 10 minutes." The real brilliant racism that the election of a BNP councillor entailed was absolutely vile. But the point was that we had to challenge it. Similarly, the BNP used to have a bloody paper sale in Brick Lane every single weekend. As a result of what had happened on the Isle of Dogs, in the Anti-Nazi League, along with other anti-racist and anti-fascists, we said, no, we are going to challenge them. And I remember the demonstration that we had here. There's a woman sitting in the audience, Sharon. She was one of the organisers at the time in East London. And we marched into Brick Lane, and we said, we're going to march up and down. And there was John Edmonds with a pathetic bunch of BNPers standing in the middle of Brick Lane. They had their bloody Union Jack and everything. And someone who's sadly no longer with us, Julie Waterson, she was there with a few other women, and she just thought, sod this for a game of soldiers, because there was a thin line of police, and she just went straight through the police lines, got hold of the Union Jack, smashed it on the head of Edmondson, and they all had to go running off to the other end of Brick Lane. They never have come back to Brick Lane since then, okay? Now, the point about this is that our politics, which began from saying that there are no-go areas for anti-racists, but also we had to challenge other people on the left. It wasn't always easy. There was a Bengali anti-racist organisation in Brick Lane that used to say that, we can protect our own community. We don't need the white left coming in and telling us how to do this. Well, they weren't the ones that broke through the police lines to chase the BNP off the street. It was black and white anti-racists together. And the question of politics, about saying that, we have unity in action between black and white people, that it is our side and our class that can win if we stand together and we do not make a single concession to fascism or racism, that's the sort of politics that has to be injected into the movement.
Yeah, comrades, I want to draw attention to something that has said and something that's important that we make a link to, and that's the death of Stephen Lawrence, the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, but also the shooting down of Mark Duggan, because I think what happens is the British politicians now, particularly people like Cameron, who are horrible racists, now will get up and say Stephen Lawrence was a nice, respectable young man. He was a young man who went to college. He was a young man who was planning to be an architect. He came from a solid, respectable middle-class family, and they try and treat him as if actually he's something special compared to the likes of Mark Duggan, who really is a criminal. And actually, we know now from what's come out recently that actually the police and the Met were trying to discredit Stephen Lawrence and trying to make out that he was a local drug dealer and all of this stuff. And I work with young people. I work with a lot of young people who've been excluded from schools, black and white people, people who the press like to demonise. And actually, a lot of young people live in a 50-50 world. There are tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of young people, young black men now, who have the potential to be Stephen Lawrence's, you know what I mean? Young men who are going to college now and who are being demonised by the police, who are being demonised by the state, and actually trying to make out that they're one step away from crime. And actually, it's funny, a couple of years after Stephen Lawrence died, I don't know if people remember, the then Labour Home Secretary, Jack Straw, his 17-year-old son, we used to call him Jack Boot Straw at the time, his 17-year-old son was actually caught doing underage drinking in a pub, but he was also caught selling cannabis, what like young people in the streets call shotting. And actually that young man wasn't demonised. That man now is someone who's probably got a respectable job, earning a 6-figure salary, you know what I mean? And at the time, the media just treated him like a young man who made a mistake. And actually what we need to say is that actually You know, today, something like between 16 and 24, I think 50% of 16 to 24-year-old black men in London, 50% of them are unemployed. And it's no longer, it's no surprise that we see a world where people are drawn. And what we have to do is be there every time a racist, whether people are stopped by the police, whether people are attacked by racists, we have to say that those lives are important lives, you know. And actually, in Hackney, after the riots, we set a campaign called Stop Criminalising Hackney Youth, because we're sick and tired of people young people being demonised. And the last thing I want to finish off is I think the real importance of the Stephen Lawrence campaign is actually emerged two really important issues. The fight against the BNP. And I remember the day after the demonstration, the week after the demonstration, Socialist Workers' front page was, "This march was magnificent. 60,000 people had marched, black and white, had marched to tear down the racists, you know." But actually the campaign as well, the Stephen Lawrence campaign, also showed that the racism of the police and corruption of the police were actually, and the state, are intertwined, and it's made it much more easier for us now as socialists to go and show those arguments.
Hi comrades, my name's Bill and I'm a disability person, and a few years ago I went to a place called Bolton and there was a few friends there and all the rest of the people who'd been fighting fascism for many, many years, and this was a fantastic, one of the greatest demonstrations against the scum that I've been on to. It's the first demonstration that I've ever been on to that I saw the police that looked like fascists running up the road with suits on and all the rest of it. But the only thing that I smiled about was that the police dog hurt the police officer. Then my granddaughter says, "Grandad, you've been on them demonstrations again?" I says, "Yes, it's good fun. We can stop the police and all that kind of thing. And we stop horrible people who think your friend has got a colour in her face. They get rid of them." But Grandad now is a disability person that understands from fascism means kill people like me, us, like very fast. The BNP, the NF and all the rest of it, I've been on the demonstrations with most of us here for years and years and years, and I live with the most intellectual, fantastic person that I could ever live with as a human. Claire showed me more understanding. Yes, you did. You showed me more understanding of intellectual understanding of fighting racism and fighting fascism. You people, you're a comrade, and people like you keep me smiling every time. And if you're not a member of the fight against fascism, please join me and the rest of us, because if we don't, let's look at Europe and worry about it for the next 5 years.
Comrades, I first started coming to Marxism in 1988, showing my age there, and I remember us talking about institutional racism then, but frankly, for then and for the next decade, the idea of institutional racism really was something that was limited to small political groups and a few intellectuals and academics. It's right to describe the Lawrence campaign as a defining struggle because it really did drag the idea of institutional racism out of the academies, out of small discussion groups, and placed it absolutely at the centre of our understanding of racism in British society. And it happened, as Hass has quite rightly said, not because Sir William Macpherson of Cluny intended to reach that conclusion. It happened precisely because every single time the police or council chiefs or education chiefs said, "We are not racist, we've got this policy document that proves that we're not racist," ordinary people stood up and said, they might have this policy document, it is rubbish, this is our lived experience in the communities that they police, that they run the housing policy, and so on. It was precisely because people, ordinary people up and down the country, sent that message out that they were forced to reach that conclusion. Macpherson was forced to conclude that the police were racist. In terms of Condon, of course he should have been sacked and people were ready to march. Instead, Straw said that he should stay on and lead the campaign to eradicate racism from the Metropolitan Police, and the guy that he appointed to lead the fight against racism and racists was a guy called John Grieve. John Grief has been in the news in the last couple of days because he is the man who bugged Dwayne Brooks's consultations with his solicitor. Shows how rotten it is. Now, Hass has written, I'm going to make a plug for our book, Say It Loud. Hass has written an absolutely brilliant chapter on the Lawrence campaign, and the rest of the book, I'm bound to say, is brilliant. But we've written it not because we want people to just have an interesting read. This is a book about the history of racism and resistance in this country and abroad, and we want it to be a tool that people can use to build the struggles that we need to build now and in the future. It is dedicated to Julie Waterson. It's dedicated to Julie Waterson, not for sentimental reasons, but because she embodied the very best traditions of working class struggle. A tiny working class woman from Scotland, absolutely at the heart, someone who dedicated her life to fighting against racism, fighting against women's oppression, fighting for our class. That's why the book is dedicated to Julie. The one thing I would disagree with Hassan on, which is this about Welling, and it epitomises what Julie stood for. She wasn't incapacitated, actually. She should have been, and they told her to get into an ambulance and go because she wasn't fit to be on that demonstration. She stayed bloodied throughout and stood with people on that demonstration throughout. That's what Julie represented. That's why the book is dedicated to her. I want to say this because one of the other examples that we mention, this is the Julies of the future, and this gives the lie to all that filth that we hear about how working class people are the people who are racist and the people at the top are anti-racist, and they just have to kind of pander a little bit to the racism of ordinary people. One of the other episodes that we refer to is, and there was a play about this, it was at the Edinburgh Festival and then toured, called Glasgow Girls, about on a working class estate, girls in a school, you know, where you would expect them to be the most racist if the lies that we're told from the top are true, where they campaigned for their classmates who were from refugee backgrounds to stay in this country when the government was seeking to deport them. And they fought a campaign that won and that still exists today. That's the tradition that we stand in. That's the tradition that we try and talk about in the book. That is the tradition that we need to continue building now and in the future.
Before Jan Nielsen.
I just wanted to say that the party has been absolutely central at the heart of fighting both fascism and against racism, whether you talk about the Anti-Nazi League period or you talk about Unite Against Fascism today. I feel like a bit like we're going a bit down memory lane when we start talking about the Unity demonstration. I was the Anti-Nazi League organiser for Sheffield, and we had a most enormous mobilisation for that demonstration. Also, I remember that we booted out the fascist who worked in the job centre. We had strike action against Simon Chadwick being in there, and we booted him out, and that was fantastic. And then later on he was arrested for having arms in the boot of his car, because these people are fucking dangerous people when it comes down to it. But I want to say also, it continues really through to today. You know, if you think about 3 weeks ago, we had enormous demonstration in Sheffield. We've had 2 enormous demonstrations. The first one, we confronted the fascists, we held the line, the police sources tried to push us back, but we linked arm and we refused to let them through. The second time, the police were there. 1,000 police they put into Sheffield, cost £500,000 to make sure a tiny number of fascists were allowed to lay their wreath. And there was a 2,000 mobilisation of people from Sheffield. And a very, very short period of time, which it just tells you how fantastic it was. The Trades Council of Sheffield congratulated Unite Against Fascism and condemned the police, because that money could have been used to pay for the things that ordinary working class people needed. And I want to say something about the police, right? I mean, the police are completely rotten to the core. They are the state. The state are in there to wreck the left, really. And there's no doubt, when you look at what Norman Betterson did. Norman Betterson, he's that bastard, right, he was the man at the heart of Hillsborough. He's that bastard who was at the heart of Orgreave, right, and he's the one who tried to fit up the Lawrence family. You have to know your bloody enemy. That's who they are. They're our enemy.
We did indicate to speak, but we've run out of time. Hass will sum up after Jan's finished.
Okay, I think there are really a couple of very, very important lessons that we all have to learn from the Lawrence family in the history of fighting racism. And it's firstly, the importance of the United Front. I mean, not many people have explicitly talked about the Anti-Nazi League and the role that the Anti-Nazi League played in this period. And it's important to remember that it had only been set up a few months before the murder of Stephen Lawrence. But yet, in the aftermath of that, it was able to organise the important events that people have talked about, the thousands of people who marched in Welling and ended up closing down the BNP's organisational headquarters. The fact that we were on the streets the Sunday after the election of Beacon and were able to get the Nazis off the street. And it's important because the Nazis in Brick Lane, and it's difficult to imagine this now, but they had had a paper sale every single Sunday since the 1970s. But actually organising with people who are not necessarily revolutionary socialists, the SWP understood the importance of organising all anti-racists, no matter what their political opinion, on the one question of fighting the fascists. The carnival that we organised in Brockwell Park a year later. And this has been a climate we created, revolutionary socialists, working with people outside of our ranks, created a climate in Britain which is completely different from the climate in France, or completely different to the political climate in much of the rest of Europe. And also, I think it's important how we've continued the anti-racist struggle through standing up against Islamophobia. I was in a meeting this morning about Turkey, and continually across Europe and beyond, there are socialists or people who claim to be socialists who don't understand the importance of defending Muslim people, defending the right of Muslim women to wear the veil, defending the right of multiculturalism and, in our society. So I think we stand in this room, as SWP members, many of us, in a very, very important position, and we should be very proud of what we've managed to do in Britain to beat back the racists. But Hassan also talked about the Thamesmead estate. Now, I had the kind of privilege, actually, of being a secondary school teacher at the time of Stephen Lawrence, and in a school just on the edge of the Thamesmead estate. Now, to be honest, when we say the fascists need to go back to the sewers, in actual fact, the Thamesmead estate was one of the most horrendous places I have ever visited. I could not imagine what it would be like raising my own children on an estate that was so impoverished. And that was in 1993, across Britain, as a result of austerity and as a result of the kind of Tory policies we're seeing being implemented. We are going to see more and more of those kind of deprived working class areas where all the sorts of social services that people rely on are going to be taken away from them. We will expect it is in those conditions that the Nazis and the fascists are able to grow. And we need to understand that we have an absolutely excellent record, but we have so much more to do. So what my job here today is to tell you that there are going to be buckets collecting money, because we are organising a massive demonstration on the 29th of September outside the Tory party conference. We want to bring to that demonstration thousands and thousands of people. But to do this work, it's not just about words, it is about resources. So I am going to ask you to dig deep into your pockets, to remember the tradition of fighting, building the United Front, which we should all be so proud of, but we have to get rid of the conditions that breed racism in our society. And if we are to do that, we have to have a socialist transformation, and it has to start on the 29th of September when we book the coaches, we book the trains, and we get outside the Tory party conference with all of the people around us, so that we give hope to people living on those estates, and we're building a different sort of future.
Thanks.
going to ask Hass to sum up after an excellent discussion.
Yes, very quickly. I mean, I guess the first thing I want to do is pay tribute to all those comrades and all the people that they got involved in the struggle against the BNP and in support of the Lawrence campaign, because you know it was high stakes, and you shouldn't forget that in terms of you know debating the tactics of anti-fascism is just not an academic debate to be had in colleges or on blogs. Actually, it's about the streets, what you do at the precise moment in time, how well rooted you are, how many people you can influence, whether you've got actually the guts to go on that estate in Thamesmead and leaflet up and down it and so on and so forth. This is real people in the real world we're talking about. But I just want to pick up on Balvinder's original point about Southall. And I have to say, it's very interesting when you look at actually the history of anti-racism in this country. In actual fact, one period is connected to the other. Because the organiser of the Stephen Lawrence family campaign was a man called Suresh Grover. Now, Suresh Grover used to, or still does, lead an organisation called the Southall Monitoring Group in Southall. And of course, the SMG actually grew out of that period of struggle that Balvinder is talking about. In other words, there is a link, there's a historic link between the early struggles, anti-racist struggles, and anti-fascist struggles which have gone on in this country, and the ones closer to us. A real organic link. We don't. Our side has a memory. It has a memory of how to operate. It comes out of a struggle, and it has a memory of how to operate. And those historic links are certainly there. When it comes to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, the impact of it, and Jack Straw, I have to say, Jack Straw, having granted the inquiry, did his best really to torpedo it. He put pressure on the family not to call a national demonstration, a day in support of Stephen Lawrence. And that was at the highest political level. Pressure was brought to bear on the Lawrence family, and presumably some kind of assurances were made and so on and so forth. As long as you don't call a demonstration, then ... Now, I don't know what the debates were. I'm not privy to them, but I do know that took place. And why is that? Because actually, during the middle of the Lawrence inquiry, if there had been a demonstration on the streets of Britain, not only would Condon have gone, actually the Met would have gone. They would have gone, because there would have been 2 million people on the streets. I'm absolutely certain of it, and therefore it's a political priority for the Labour government, having granted the Lawrence inquiry, seen it spin out of control, then try to reassert control over it. And their nightmare scenario really was Condon going. That's why Jack Straw, despite Condon making a complete arse of himself at the inquiry, that's why Jack Straw said the day after, Condon has my backing. Because he knew that if Condon went, then it would open up wider questions about actually the Met itself. And to be honest, it's another story, but Condon has a little bit of a history around these kind of things in Notting Hill when he was a young police officer in terms of his operation against anti-racist organisations in Notting Hill. So, there's stories to be told there. Now, the other thing about the Stephen Lawrence campaign quickly is there have been all sorts of campaigns in the recent past during the Tory years against immigration controls and so on and so forth. Some have been successful, some had not been successful, but there had always been campaigns. There had always been struggles against racism. Stephen Lawrence didn't come out of nowhere in one sense. But what you can say is because of all the elements which I'm talking about came together, actually we moved from the defensive onto the offensive. And actually we pushed, and the Lawrence family, to give them, all credit, obviously, pushed and pushed and pushed. We weren't going to be satisfied with trite explanations about the failure to catch the killers of Stephen Lawrence and the true nature of the Metropolitan Police and other police forces around the country. Not just the Met, other police forces around the country who are up to the same kind of thing. People pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed to get further and further and further to the truth. And to be honest, I think we're still on that journey in terms of trying to find the truth. When it comes to kicking the BNP off Brick Lane and the operation to kick the BNP out of East London and the operation to close down the BNP headquarters in Welling, I have to say, actually, when people think, well, is all this struggle worth it? Does it really make any difference at all? Are we, when we get up in the morning or we get on that coach in Glasgow at 12 o'clock at night to travel down to London and so on and so forth, is it worth it? Actually, if you really think about it, Looking back on it now, if you think about it, actually, the result of tens of thousands immediately in a vicinity, hundreds of thousands of people actually get involved in the Stephen Lawrence campaign and the campaigns against the BNP, both in East London and South East London, changed the nature of those places. East London would not be the East London it is today if it hadn't actually been for those campaigns, a campaign to kick Beacon out of the Isle of Dogs and kick the BNP out of Brick Lane, and then for their influence in the East End. They had been in the East End since the 1930s. Since the 1930s, when I was growing up, Hoxton, it's a place where you go for a nice cappuccino these days. You couldn't go in near Hoxton without getting shit kicked out of you, frankly. There were actually racist National Front families who used to run Hoxton Market. They wouldn't let you in it. Look at Hoxton today. It's not just a evolution because society's got more civilised, or because the property developers decided they have to move into that area. Actually, in one sense, in a quite strange way, we kind of, the anti-racists, the anti-fascists, actually cleared the way for the regeneration of the East End because, and all the, and whatever, you win some, you lose some, nothing's ever whatever. But yeah. Exactly. But, actually they would have invested in the East End. But actually, more fundamentally, the East End have been a very, very different place. The South East London, even I can report that Thamesmead these days actually is not the Thamesmead it was before. South East London is not the South East London it was before. And I'll give you one really good concrete indicator of that. When Lee Rigby was killed in Woolwich, actually, if that had happened, I know you have to think back 10 years, 15 years previously, to be honest, the reaction would have been very, very different. We'd have a very, very, the EDL might have been able to actually spark something off. The fact that they couldn't actually really spark anything off in Woolwich this year on that brutal murder of Lee Rigby shows you how much South East London has changed, right? And to be honest, it's people in this room and outside this room that made the difference. They made history. They really did change things. People, when you get involved in struggle and you bring people in, Jan was talking about United Front, and you become a big mass force, it's not only you just change the immediacy in terms of what it is that you're trying to combat, actually you change the world around you. And it's quite clear in East London and South East London, actually the world has changed. It has moved on. It's more comfortable with itself. I'm not saying there's no racism in those areas. I live in South East London, I know, whatever. But it's radically changed. So, if there's any message to come out of out of this meeting amongst all the brilliant contributions that people have made, it is worth fighting. It is worth actually braving yourself, steeling yourself to get out there and do something. It's actually worth it bringing people together to fight. Actually, in terms of a better society, it actually does change, change history. And at the core of it, you have to say, we're revolutionary socialists, and that's the truth.
Thank you, folks.